create differences in Africa to engender development? How do we accept differences in Africa without suppressing others? How do we pave way for the development of the continent, taking into consideration that Africa is cosmopolitan in many ways? So I have with me Alice, and then I have Fofana here, and then I have Adam Branch. They will be doing justice to the conversation. So I'll ask them questions, and they will respond to it accordingly. After which the audience will be allowed to come in with your questions and your contributions. We hope to have an interesting conversation. So once again, thank you for coming. So, my first question to the panel is going to be a general question. So each of them would respond to it, So, can we have a bit of historical trajectories explaining the diversities we have on the continent? Is there a historical background or antecedent explaining why Africa has so much diversity in the contemporary world or in post-colonial world? Yeah, so any of you could respond to it.
Thanks to the organizers for inviting me for a second year in a row. It's great. Okay, so I don't only think it's possible to have a historical perspective on questions of diversity in Africa. I think it's essential. I think that, so I want to take a step back in terms of the way, the question itself, and this question of diversity and conflict. So, I'm not sure if I'm the only one who spent the last week marking undergraduate exams here. And one of the things that undergraduates like to do when they get a question is, instead of answering the question, they question the question itself. And they call attention to the concepts that are used, to the assumptions behind the question, and all of that. So, being that I'm in that spirit, and it's been done to me for the last week, I'm going to do that to your question for a minute. So, I think what's important is to think about why we would associate diversity and conflict, and why we would start with the idea that diversity is somehow a problem that has to be solved. I think that obviously there's always going to be diversity in any human community. Diversity is the very definition of what it means to be human in some ways. But what that diversity is, and most importantly what it means, there's nothing natural about that. So I think that's where the historical dimension is crucial, because that's what enables us to see where the diversities that matter to us come from, to think about what their origins are, to think about the ways in which they are certainly not natural, but they may have been construed as natural over time for whatever reasons. And by looking at diversity historically, it also enables us to see ways of reframing some of perhaps the problems that we now take for granted as being associated with diversity, such as the kind of assumption that diversity is something that, if not managed, will lead to conflict. And so I would start with that. I mean, I can talk a bit more later in response to the other questions about what dimensions of the historical experience of African states and of African societies we might want to look to in order to understand the way that certain diversities have today become associated with conflict and are seen as a problem. But I'll just make a sort of brief provocative statement, which is to say that I think that the idea that African countries are defined by ethnic diversity or religious diversity, and that diversity is a problem that needs to be managed, I think that's a colonial idea. That's an idea that was formed during the colonial period, and that I think still continues to shape our ways of thinking about politics today. Which isn't to say there might not be some truth to it today, but it means that that truth has to be contextualized and historicized so that we don't take it as essential or necessary or natural. Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me extend appreciation to the organizers for inviting me to participate in the conversation around understanding our diversity in relations to conflict resolution on the continent. I'm from Liberia, and Liberia, as one of the countries in Africa, has a very interesting history when it comes to the formation and war and all of that. I will also agree with Adam in looking at the historical context of how the African diversity is looked at, and how we look at it today as whether it's problematic that we need to solve. We know colonialism has a lot to play in how our narrative as Africans is looked at. So what do we do with that form of narrative, and how is it important to understand? Because diversity in itself is the fact that it's been around since the development of humanity. People are different, communities are different, and the fact that people move from place to place, people carry culture, people carry way of life, community move. So how do we look at those diversities as an enabling tool and not filter that as a problem to be solved? And at the very heart of that, how do we explain our differences? How do we explain the conflict that has grown over time on the continent, and what are the drivers of those? So, I like to look at the question as more of understanding what role our identities have played in defining what conflicts happen, whether it's ethnic related violence or conflict, or is religiously connected. But in all of those, underneath most of the conflict, because over the last 50 years or so, most of the conflict on the continent have been internal conflict. And underneath those, you have issues that are just far beyond what is known as the reason for our ethnic violence, whether it's religious violence, or all those connotations that come. But underneath those very conflicts, you have different issues, poverty, youth unemployment, and political elites that are not satisfied with how things are going, the question of our natural resources and who are those managing. So there are many underpinning and underlying factors other than just looking at religion and differences, because those are fluid concepts. So before we understand our differences, we have to understand that the image or the narrative of religion and ethnicity as the cause of why we fight is very fluid, and is something that needs more in-depth understanding of why our countries and our continent fight.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. I am from Rwanda, and for me, the question of diversity is beyond the topic of discussion in academic issues. Diversity is either demonized. We all agree that we see it as a problem, especially in the context of African countries. It's our inability or the inability of our governors and the state leaders to manage diversity and to use them for political purposes, or from an outside perspective, it's very romanticized we're all one person anyway, and we come from one place. And there's either this really great demonization or really great romanticization. None of those two views capture the complexity of diversity on the African continent in particular. There was an academic, a scholar who wrote a little while ago, Jeffrey Hurst, who wrote about how the biggest constraint that most African state leaders really face is the sheer amount of the territory that they have to run and the inability to reach out to every one of the people that they are supposedly running, that they're supposedly leading. And this is a context that we don't really talk about. The fact that this is a continent, it's a huge mass of land which is inhabited by different people who arrived on the continent at different times in history. While I do agree that colonialism did somehow contribute very, very greatly to this demonization of race and identity issues, these issues are not ahistorical, they existed. We come from a place of great empires that used to fight against each other. So understanding conflict as if it doesn't really have a bigger sort of source that goes beyond when the white man arrived on the continent, I think is erroneous to a great extent. Because this is, I come from Rwanda, we used to be a great kingdom. We were led by a very powerful royal family which used to do conquest and annex different territories. What ended up happening with colonialism is a tragedy, of course, but that in and of itself does not mean that we were not already struggling with questions of managing diverse people who were making these kingdoms in the first place. So for me, the historical component is very, very important to understanding the conflict today. The second point I want to make is because of the way colonialism defined us, we didn't really get a chance to define ourselves. Most of our leaders have used this access that certain groups, certain ethnic groups did get to accessing the power as the only way to see diversity. And so it has somehow basically created such a mess that it's very, very hard to talk about diversity in any other way but negative way. Even though we know that there are so many other facets of diversity that the African continent has had to deal with the people in a very positive way, but we can barely see it. All we see is these problems of religion, of culture. To me, it's mind-boggling, for example, that we are seeing a conflict in Central African Republic between the Christians and the Muslims when none of those religions is actually traditional to the land. And so understanding how these important ideas of diversity that come from a place that's so far removed from who we are and how they affect our lives today is really critical to understanding the relationship that we have between conflict and diversity at the moment. But we can have this discussion.
Right. So that's an important contribution on the. Now the question of, let's say, so-called impinging religions, right, like Islam, Christianity, I think that kind of assumption has been challenged by many African scholars, in BT, who sometimes is ahistorical analysis, and other scholars, But the point is that Islam and Christianity are now seen as part of the African heritage, right? So if we look at Abi Mazuri's triple heritage, and Nkrumah's notion of the African personality, the assumption is that we can synthesize these three traditions. And in contemporary Africa, we have the Eastern religions, right, that are also come in, and there are many Africans who are devotees of these religions. So my next question is, how do we ensure the synthesization of these diverse traditions that the continent of Africa has inherited? How do we engage them and how do we bring them together so that when there's conflict, we would ask, as Funa was saying, we wouldn't say, well, it is Islam and Christianity, or it is Afro-Persian religion and let's have Christianity. How do we bring these diversities together without neutralizing the uniqueness embedded in each of these traditions in Africa?
I currently, if you look on the continent, there are all these religions and groupings are really working in different communities, like you mentioned of Central African Republic. If you understand the crisis, the purported crisis between Christians and Muslims, actually not between Christians and Muslims. The political dimension, there are other deep-rooted issues that, because even some of the young people, a lot of people talk about the vibrancy of the continent and how youthful it is. In many of these conflicts, you see majority young men who are in their early 20s, and unemployed, not in school. So the issue of unemployment is very high. And these young men, some of them have never been to a church, neither a mosque. They don't listen to any religious leaders or they didn't take any orders from any religious head or so. So just that blanket picture of Christianity and Islam is just to paint a certain picture that this is actually happening. But in terms of bringing the religions together, I think on the continent there are many examples of people working together, communities coming together. I think this idea that there's nothing working on the continent, I mean, there are many communities in Liberia, for example, in Ghana, in other places. People are working together in interreligious dialogues and having interfaith relations and doing a lot of different work. I mean, I know there's a program called the Program of Muslim and Christian Dialogue in Africa. Programora, I don't know if anyone has. Yes, I've heard of that. So there has been a lot of on the continent work going on to work together. But I think we must be able to understand the key issues that underpin these conflicts. Unemployment for young people, educational opportunities, they're not mutually exclusive from what's happening, development-related issues. So if we can solve the governance issues, what people term as the soft issues, I mean, most of these things we will be able to understand, because if we cannot deal with situation relating to basic services, for example, there are places on the continent that it's just basic health services, access to food, access to water, access to livelihood. If we can really have a conversation about solving those